All right, gentlemen, here we go. Welcome again to another episode of the American Civil War Railroad Historical Society Zoom. And you might have seen the schedule flip a little bit, but we got it back on track now. The next one will be on the 17th, and then the one after that will be on the 31st. The 17th might be Charlie Taylor and his work that he's been doing on the help me, Charlie. Pontoons. Thank you. Yeah, on the pontoons. And then one after that, I think we're going to do loads. Rhett Tyler's going to be kicking that off with the work he's been doing on an artillery train that he's configured. So with that, I will welcome Roger and Ted as well. And I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Ott for his presentation on locomotives and the colors and the work that he's been uncovering.
First job is to unmute there. Okay, everybody ready?
You bet.
Yes, sir.
All right, I'm going to share a screen and I'm going to show you guys something I've been working on for the last couple of years on and off. Get the show going here, play from start. This concerns Baldwin locomotives used by the U.S. military railroads and how they were painted and how we know how they were painted. And just as a real quick recap, everybody probably, this is all pretty basic for you guys. Before the Civil War's end, USMRR was one of the largest railroad systems in America, had 419 locomotives, 6,000 cars, 25,000 men. And the USMRR conducted a high pressure hunt over 3 years to acquire locomotives, both new and used. And one of the results of that was that it doubled the price of locomotives. This being in the days before anybody really thought about war profiteering. The USMRR bought locomotives from 13 different suppliers. And the one we're concerned with tonight is going to be Baldwin. These men decided the motive power for the railroads. And again, these guys are all going to be familiar with you, but man, look at all their beards when you line them up. Colonel Dan McCallum, Colonel Herman Hopt, Colonel John Devereaux were actually the main managers of the operation, and they would have been the ones that chose the locomotives. Now, Dan McCallum was a bridge builder. He probably didn't have that much input, but both Hopt and Devereaux were railroad veterans. And Hopt in particular worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad before the war. And I think this may have something to do with the stuff that I uncovered about locomotive paint and color. Now Baldwin built 33 new engines for the railroad. 7 were standard gauge that were used in Virginia and North Carolina. And 26 were 5-foot gauge, which were used in the Western Theater. This didn't really have anything to do with preference or anything. It was just what they needed to order at that particular time. You add in the 10 older Baldwins that got purchased used and 7 Baldwins that were captured. They were running 50 Baldwins, which was 1/8 of the total number of locomotives that the USMRR had. And this all kind of presents the same old modeler's challenge that we're all familiar with. How were the Baldwin locomotives painted? What colors did they use? And in general, before anything specific, we can say that before the war, Baldwin locomotives were highly decorated and very colorful. But by the mid-1860s, and this was general across all railroads, across all America, tastes in locomotive decoration had sobered up considerably. And yeah, just look around you. takes a shooting war to really get people to concentrate and to sober up a little bit. So yeah, no more party colors.
Right. Of course.
Now, what started this all off was in 2019, I was given digital copies of 4 little handwritten notebooks from the Baldwin factory. They're paint and lettering notebooks from 1860 to 1870. And they currently live at the DeGolyer Library at SMU in Texas. And I was up at the Golden Spike celebration in 2019 in Ogden, Utah. I was giving a presentation on Central Pacific and Union Pacific locomotives. And after the presentation, Randy Hees walks up to me. Randy is he just retired. He was the director of the Nevada Southern Railroad Museum in Boulder, Nevada. He gave me a little thumb drive and said, "Hey, John, you're going to be interested in this." And I took them home, and they were all pages of these 4 notebooks. I went through locomotive by locomotive, and you can see on the right there what the kinds of instructions that were written on them. Getting them was a real thrill, but the instructions were all really incomplete. Only certain parts of any given locomotive were being called out. They almost presented more of a puzzle than anything else. Yeah, okay, wheels black, yellow wheel covers. Well, what about the rest of the locomotive? There was a lot of information that was missing.
Mm.
Some instructions were really maddeningly vague. Dark colors, no gold. USMRR in ribbon, painted in dark colors, no gold on sides of tank. Others were much more detailed, but they were still missing really vital information, like what was the ground color? How were these locomotives painted overall, basically, before you went in and did the detailing? And the more I looked at the books, the more I realized very few specs for any locomotive, for railroad's orders, were mentioning ground colors. Now, it was Randy himself that gave me the best clue about how to use the notebooks. The most important stuff was the stuff that wasn't written, because that covered the information that everybody in the paint shop would already know how to do. In other words, Baldwin's painters had standard paints that they used, standard schemes that they used. The notebooks recorded only the special requests for painting particular locomotives in a non-standard way. So that led to the question, well, how were the Baldwin locomotives in the Civil War years normally painted? What colors did they use? And I went back through the notebooks, locomotive by locomotive, color by color, and did a process of elimination, looking for the colors in the notebooks that weren't ever mentioned. If tender flanges were indicated to be green, that meant that they weren't normally green. Same for all the other parts of the locomotive that were called out in colors in these notebooks. And to make a long story short, and long process short, that narrowed the colors choices for ground colors for the locomotives during the 1860s down to some species of dark brown. And let's see here. I double checked this with a couple of locomotive historians who you guys probably know, Jim Wilkie and Dave Fletcher. Jim Wilkie is the guy who's responsible for the color choices of the locomotives up in Promontory. Dave Fletcher is the guy who does the beautiful locomotive renderings in Narrow Gauge and Shortline Gazette. He's a Baldwin expert. And yeah, best they knew, Baldwins in the 1860s were mostly umber brown. Now, coincidentally or not, the common note in the notebooks, dark colors, no gold, was also standard for the Pennsylvania Railroad engines. And that scheme from the early 1860s is pretty well established by existing Pennsylvania records as being dark umber brown with vermilion wheels. that gave me a starting point. It made sense that the same paint would be used by both Baldwin and the Pennsylvania Railroad. You know, they were neighbors in Pennsylvania. Baldwin supplied most of the Pennsylvania Railroad engines. They were using the same specs in the notebooks. It sure seemed to me like that was the logical thing. They were using the same dark umber that the Pennsylvania would have used. Now, what shade of dark umber that was, I did a little bit more digging, and I come to realize that this was about the age when the color that we know as Pullman brown started to be used. Now, that color got associated with Pullman cars, but it was also used on engines and coaches and wagons and everything else at the time. And it eventually was such a common thing, it was picked up as the basic color for UPS trucks. Although you got to be careful, the UPS brown that they started with is not the same thing as modern UPS brown. The old Pullman brown was a lot darker. It was just a shade off of black. And it was made by mixing lamp black and Indian red and yellow ochre pigments. It also made it a very difficult color to duplicate. I found out from reading about the color in relationship to passenger cars. Just a little bit more yellow ochre and the color went greenish. Just a little bit more Indian red, the color went brownish. It was really kind of a difficult color to work with. But it made sense given the pigments involved, the cheap pigments involved, just the general description of dark color, kind of an indiscriminate, indistinct color. I will bet that the dark umber that they used was some version of Pullman brown. Let's see if I can get this thing to advance. Here we go. I isolated all the pages from the notebooks that contain paint specs for USMRR engines to see if there are any other patterns. And yeah, there were. I identified 3 individual paint schemes. And just as an aside, I'm going to put a PDF of these files, of these pages in the files section of our group website so that everybody can use them, refer to them on their own.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Now, I took the paint descriptions and added them to Rick Huckadell's USMRR book, which is also something that's in the file section of our website. And that gave me a chronological list of the engines and their paint schemes. And I could tell from that that the 3 different paint schemes were used in sequence. They weren't something just chosen randomly, but they represented the evolution of the paint for the engines at the Baldwin factory over a period of 2 years and 2 months, which is the period of time where the USMRR was buying engines from Baldwin. So I drew up 1 engine for each paint scheme. Now the first scheme covered 5 engines that were put in service in the middle of 1862. The Samson, the Union, the Vulcan, the George Parker, and the Lily. All these are, they should be familiar to you guys. They all served in Virginia. They were all photographed. They were very commonly used engines. There was also 3 others that had numbers but no names. They were used in the West that also had the same paint scheme. These were the ones that were designated painted in dark colors, no gold, which means no gilt. It doesn't mean no yellow. It just means no gold gilt on any part of the engine. Again, very businesslike, very military, very sober and not flashy. And then in ribbon on the sides of the tank, United States Military Railroads. Now the Baldwin ribbon was a very elaborate piece of artwork, which fortunately for me, a friend of mine named Tim Muir had already rendered. So I just borrowed it from him. And this is what the George Parker, built in November 1862. I think I got the date wrong probably. But anyway, it was built in 1862. But this is what it would have looked like with the dark umber paint, the name and the ribbon. Again, vermilion wheels, because that was standard for Baldwin engines at the time. And it's a very sober looking military locomotive. Now the next scheme covered 10 engines, 2 with ribbons on the tender and 8 with only plain lettering. Now these were, again, are locomotives you guys ought to be familiar with. The General Dix and the C. Vibbard. There are also locomotives in the West that were sent to the Western Theater. They didn't have names. They all went into service between November 1862 and May 1864. And the General Dix might be especially important because it was used in City Point. Had the instructions: wheels black and striped, yellow wheel covers, and sandbox green. And they, again, and ribbon on sides of tank, United States Military Railroads. On back of tank, General Dix. And that's how the General Dix came out. Now we're getting a little bit more color. We got those yellow wheel covers, the green sandbox. It's getting to be looking a little bit less serious, a little bit more colorful.
Question, John. You called the wheel covers. Were they actually referred to as fenders at that time, or did that come later?
They were not called fenders. That's later. That's our terminology for them. Fenders or splashers. Back in those days, they were called wheel covers.
Got it.
And they were a feature for most Baldwin locomotives in that time. A lot of other locomotive builders used them too. They're just a decorative way of doing wheel splashers, keep the mud off the rest of the locomotive.
Right.
Now, coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, at that same time, the Pennsylvania Railroad was also beginning to order umber engines with black wheels. Black wheels are kind of unique, or not unique, but they hadn't been seen before. This was something new for the 1860s. A lot of the Baldwin specs specify them, and just anecdotally from a lot of other lithographs and so forth, railroads were beginning to use black wheels. Again, it seems like it's kind of a parallel what the military railroads were doing, and the Pennsylvania Railroad also. Now the third group was the largest, 11 engines. They were all used in the West, and they were all delivered in 1864. They were numbers 155 through 165. And that only left 4 engines in the entire list of Baldwin engines that I didn't have notes for. And they fell into the gap between one notebook and the next notebook. Apparently they were never recorded, or the page was lost or something. But based in their place in the sequence, they could have been either Scheme 2, which you just saw, or Scheme 3, which we're seeing now. These are interesting. The wheels are claret. Claret is a dark purplish red. House, which means cab. Cab had green panels and claret stiles. Stiles, S-T-I-L-E-S. That means basically top and bottom stripes. Tank flange and panels green, and stiles claret. So again, claret on the heavy stripes, top and bottom.
Wow.
On the tender tank. Tender frame and trucks green. On sides of tank and panel, ACWRR, and back 155, etc. But that's how they turned out.
Hmm.
They were getting to
Wow.
be quite colorful.
Right.
I really like that combination of green and the dark purplish red. Really makes an attractive looking locomotive.
Another question on the smoke box, or what not the smoke box, the where the lantern is, or the lamp, what do you call that?
Right. Mhm.
The lamp box, yeah, with the painting on it.
Mhm. Yeah, well, that was interesting. If you went back to the previous slide here, oops, went right by it. Here we go. You can see they had a painted headlight.
Who chose that? Was that a
Copying it off of
factory? Was that a factory choice?
that was probably a factory choice. I really can't see them sitting down and decorating lanterns in the middle of a war. And you could, I know from the old catalogs, you could buy locomotive lamps fully painted.
Right.
It cost you about $2 extra. You could order them in plain black with striping, or you could buy them fully painted.
Hmm.
And this was standard in a couple of lamp catalogs, so I kind of assume that it was probably something that you could do across the whole industry. So my guess was that these lamps were factory painted.
Right.
Right. Right.
Who
Beautiful.
knows how they got them? They may have been leftovers from one of the railroads they took over, or they could have been a new order. Who knows where they came from?
Mm-hmm.
The lamps really didn't. Lamps didn't belong with specific locomotives. They were something that was owned by the shops or by the engineer himself or something else. You could swap lamps around on locomotives all you wanted to, and a lot of railroads did.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Were
So
any
if
of
I,
these, were any of these colors standard for other Army equipment such as caissons or gun carriages or wagons?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. All I can say is that this is the stuff out of the Baldwin paint notebooks, and whether they were specific. I have a slide that talks about that later on. Whether they were specific to Baldwin or specific to the military railroads, I don't know at this point. But to continue the story, again, paralleling the Pennsylvania Railroad also used the same kinds of color arrangements for their locomotives. You can see here, this locomotive pulled Lincoln's funeral train. But here again, see the green panels, the green tensor flange, the red stiles top and bottom. Obviously picking up the same style, STYLE style of paint that we saw in the military railroad.
Mm.
So that led to another question I had, which so far has eluded an answer, or an answer has eluded it. I wonder if other engine builders were being told to use the same paints. I did a few other engines out of my collection with the same kinds of paint schemes to see how they would look. Here's how a Norris engine looks. The Beckwith, based on the different shades in the black and white photographs. Yeah, it could have been. It could have been painted this way. They could have used black wheels. We know that other Norris locomotives from that period used black wheels. It's entirely possible that, again, going back to Herman Haupt, when he sent out orders for locomotives, he could have been giving out instructions saying paint them, dark colors, black wheels.
Just below the cab, there's that yellow line that runs halfway across the boiler. That's the deck with which they'd walk out on, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, that's the running board.
And that would have been wood, correct?
Yeah, it's wood with brass nosing. In other words, what you're seeing there on the side view, that's all brass.
Right.
Oh, oh, okay. So okay, that makes sense for, so it would last a while. I forget.
Was that wood stained? Or,
That's a good question. I don't know, and I assume that it's dependent on the builder and the railroad. You don't see too many top views of locomotives in old photographs, so it's
Right.
really hard to tell. The few that I have seen have led me to believe that they were probably painted, but who knows? They could have been like freight car running boards, just left unpainted. But
were the cabs stained?
I'm sorry.
Were the cabs stained?
The cabs were mostly stained in this period.
Yeah.
In
They
the
were
course
mostly
of
natural wood.
maintaining these locomotives, would they have to be repainted periodically, and would they paint them the same color, or would they? I don't imagine they'd want to keep a zillion different colors in stock.
Locomotives were usually painted every 3 to 5 years, and sometimes more common than that. And when they were repainted in the locomotive, in the railroad paint shops, it was up to the railroad. They could either mimic what the original paint was, or they could go off in their own direction.
I
Are
think
there-
there would have been some. I'm getting that. Never mind.
There
there
wasn't a question of
surviving
keeping paint in
locomotives?
stock either, because paint was basically mixed in the shop. So what you kept in stock were pigments and linseed oil.
Are there
Yeah,
surviving locomotives that had paint that you could look at?
Unfortunately not. That's been something that I've looked into extensively because I've been doing a lot of these drawings. And that's one of the basic things that locomotive historians do. Is they go in, they try to find a spot on the locomotive where it's likely that paint would have survived. They take sandpaper and they just start sanding away to see what layers of paint are there. Now this is fine, except for one thing. Back in the 19th century, when they prepared a locomotive for a new paint job, they stripped it down to the bare metal. They scraped, and then they used lye to remove the old paint.
Wow.
And that pretty much, no matter which old historical locomotive you look at, it's almost never that you can find any layer of paint earlier than, say, 1880s, 1870s at the outside. This goes for the General, this goes for the Texas, this goes for the William Mason in the Baltimore Museum. This goes for, like I said, almost every historical locomotive that there is. The Governor Stanford up in the California State Museum, all the Virginia and Truckee locomotives, they've all been examined by using the scrape test. And they just, there is no original paint that's left. That's one of the reasons why all this stuff is such a big mystery, because there's just no surviving evidence. It wasn't until late in the 1800s that paint shops got so lazy that they just repainted over old paint and didn't bother to scrape off the stuff that was underneath.
Two-part question, John. One, you can confirm probably that at least in the Southern railroads, is it that it was true that typically an engineer would be assigned to a particular locomotive and that's the only one he'd run, correct?
That's right. That's pretty much standard all across the nation too.
Right.
And would he have had say in terms of if they were going to paint it, whenever anything about that, or was he just responsible for just engineering the loco?
Far as I can understand, in most cases, what was done to the locomotive was the province of the master mechanic. Every roundhouse, every major repair facility had a master mechanic that made the decisions of what to do with what locomotive, and how it was treated, and where it was going to run. And I don't know for every railroad. It's entirely possible. Maybe the engineer had some say in it, but he had to defer to the master mechanic in any case. And that's where the decision was probably made 99% of the time.
I
Thanks.
believe, I believe there were a few things that engineers had a little wiggle room on. Like I've read that some engineers would replace the whistle with a chime whistle of their own liking. Or they might attach a symbol to the smoke box door, like a Masonic symbol or something like that. But I think John's basically right, the master mechanic. And I think the decision as to how a locomotive was going to be painted was going to be made at a higher level than coming down and consulting the engine driver, who they probably didn't even know at the time who was going to be assigned to that engine. So I think that's pretty unlikely.
Yeah.
John, I have a question about your, the drawing there.
Sure.
Let's see, it's telling me I'm muted. Okay. I'm looking at the bell rope, and it looks like it goes to the sand pipe. Does the sand pipe stick out from the sides of the locomotive? That one?
The sand pipes ran down the edge of, or the edge of the boiler. This was a Norris sand dome, which meant it was mounted on a pedestal, and the sand drained from the bottom of the hopper, but then ran down the pipe and ran down the front of the wheel cover.
I stand corrected, John. I meant the steam dome.
Oh, steam dome. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, no. What you're seeing there is the steam pipe for the injector.
Okay,
You see
it
the
looks
injector
like the bell cord.
driving wheels.
The bell cord just looks like there was some kind of fitting that it would help hold the bell cord up.
Yeah, the bell cord was draped over the fitting that
Okay.
and the control. They obviously had a screw control up there in the cab for letting the steam down into the injector. That was just an odd little detail I found in the photograph of the Beckwith that I used as reference.
It's neat.
Is
John,
there a policy or a procedure for choosing the names of the locomotives?
That was real high. That was real high level, I'm pretty sure. That you could almost tell, especially in terms of the military railroads, where the first batch of engines was mainly named after the principals of the line. Yeah, they had a McCallum, and they had a Devereaux, and of course they had a Herman Haupt, which I'm going to get to here in just a second. I wanted to show you guys one more possible paint job. You guys all remember this,
Yep.
the General Grant. Just for fun, I recolored it based on what the other locomotives were at that time. At least the Baldwin locomotives. I gave it claret wheels and a dark umber paint job. I think it came out pretty neat.
Oh, yeah.
So this could be an alternative in case anybody is thinking about modeling this. I think this is just as viable an alternative as to the scheme I came up with 6 years ago, where it was it was dark red rather than dark umber. But I think the dark color really makes the all the decoration on the tender pop real well.
And what about the boiler and the smokestack? They're all kind of gray or black in your images there.
Boilers and smokestacks were never painted. There was too much heat, and the paint was all based on linseed oil. It didn't last very long in that kind of an environment. So boilers and smokestacks were basically painted with a mix of oil and lamp black. And I think other railroads had similar kinds of formulas. But, basically it was just bare dark metal.
You used to be able to buy stove black when I was a kid, which was what you put on your cast iron stoves. I think that must have been something similar for smoke boxes and chimneys.
Yeah, most likely something that resisted heat. That was the main concern there. But anyway, yeah, going to the general hops. One of the other questions that rose through all this project was asking if engine colors were chosen by the builders or by the customers. Now, this is a pretty legitimate question, and maybe it depended on the builder. It kind of looks to me, from looking at the Baldwin notebooks, that all these notes, all these different variations on the locomotives, they must have been customer driven, because I really can't see somebody at Baldwin sitting down and scribbling, oh, let's, just for fun, let's make this green with pink here and purple there. No, some of the color schemes are really loud and illogical, and I think that they probably came from the customer rather than a Baldwin representative, who would probably be just as happy painting everything one solid color and letting it go.
Right.
We know that William Mason had a passion for painting his locomotives blue, and I don't think he gave his customers a choice, because all the locomotives that came out of his shop, no matter what railroad they went to, had the same kind of patterning on the stripes and everything else. I think they were, I think if you bought a Mason locomotive, you also bought the paint scheme.
Right.
And because Mason liked blue locomotives, we've always reconstructed the General Hot in blue. And other locomotives likewise, other Mason locomotives likewise, like the General McCallum.
Mark?
John,
Hello.
could we just go back briefly to the General Hop?
Sure.
This has been a little sort of a pet thing of mine in my drawers for the last couple of years. I've got a couple of the IHC Riverossi General Hops.
Oh,
I know the color is totally wrong. It's all green with the trim. But so help me, it looks like the dimensions of the engine and everything are pretty much spot on for the Baldwin that we're seeing in your photo. Would you guys concur with that? A long time ago, I was told these were post-war locomotives. They were too big, but this looks like the dimensions are almost spot on for that picture of the General Hop.
well, the IHC locomotives were patterned after post-war Baldwins. They were taken from the Virginian Truckee engines from 1871.
Okay.
That being said, they're almost identical in dimensions to the locomotives I've been showing you tonight.
Right.
The Baldwin
That
locomotive.
was the picture that I was getting. Yeah, it looked
Yeah.
that way. And also the decoration, again, the color's probably not right, but geez, the decoration on the tender and everything for the hop tier looks almost identical to the picture. So it looks like somebody at Riverossi or IHC who originally put that thing out did their homework.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, well,
well,
that
it's,
means I might be able to use them in a diorama at some stage.
Oh, sure. Well, painted green, again, it's really kind of a assumption that the hops and the other Mason locomotives are painted blue. This is the difference between the locomotives we're making assumptions about and the notebook locomotives that I found that actually have a little bit of documentary evidence behind them.
Have you done this drawing also substituting the other color scheme for this one?
Not yet. It takes time to draw them. I only drew up a couple to,
It just seems like that would be interesting to contrast the two of these too.
yes, it would. I agree. I fully agree.
Would there be any distinction between locomotives used for passenger service and freight service, and correlation between the locomotive paint job and passenger car or freight car paint jobs?
Yes, there was, especially in commercial railroads like the Pennsylvania. They had a freight locomotive paint scheme and a passenger locomotive paint scheme. A lot of other railroads did the same thing. I'm kind of based on what we've found in the notebooks. I've made the assumption that military railroads only used one paint scheme, which makes sense because they weren't really a commercial passenger hauling railroad.
Right.
Their only concern was hauling bacon and beans out to the troops in the Virginia battlefields.
And if locomotives were captured or transferred to another part of the country for some reason, they would probably not repaint them right away, but they would just have a mix of paint jobs, I guess.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. That's another good question. We don't have any records to that. We know that a lot of captured Union locomotives got renamed. And if they got renamed, that usually means they got repainted in some fashion, and so they could put on the new name. Like the Baltimore, Ohio locomotive 188, I believe it was, got renamed the Lady Davis after it got stolen and taken down to Richmond.
Right.
So my guess is that they bothered to repaint it a little bit. One of these Masons was stolen and renamed the Pocahontas. And, that was General McCollum's first locomotive. This one is actually the third locomotive named after him. But the first one was stolen and it was renamed Pocahontas. And if it had a portrait of General McCollum like this one did, you could pretty much guarantee it got repainted. So anyway, just to close tonight, I did a little proof of concept model. I took one of my old Bachmans, not the new Bachmans, but I have a scrap box full of old Bachmans, just to color it up, paint it up, see how it looked in the Baldwin colors that I uncovered.
Nice.
And it's not a great locomotive. I haven't got it to run yet. There's something wrong with the universal joint. The stick spins, the engine spins, but the locomotive doesn't move. And I haven't had time to figure out what the problem is, but it's getting there.
Right.
And going back to running boards, there you can see a top side of running boards. And there I put on an unpainted running board.
Right.
Just to show how that might have looked.
So that brings me to a question I was going to ask you about how it was attached to the boiler if it was wood, because you don't really see any like angle irons or anything that support it. Any guess on how that was attached, John?
Yeah, angle irons. You just don't see them.
What's there?
I say yes, angle irons.
Angle irons.
You just don't see them.
Just they're under the running board.
Right.
That's right. Now, if you look at some of the existing locomotives, like I don't know, like the William Mason, like the Virginia and Truckee locomotives, you get a good close look at them. Yeah, they got angle irons. They got stuff there, and in many cases, the stuff you would see normally coming down and around the boiler, that's stuck in under the boiler jacket, so it isn't really all that visible.
Right. Yep.
The other is when you look at so many of these photos, there are different stacks. And was that just an evolution of what was more efficient, or was there a different rationale for the choice of a stack?
That had a lot to do with who the master mechanic was. A lot of railroads, their master mechanic developed the kind of stack he wanted to use.
Right.
That's why Pennsylvania railroads, locomotives all have Laird stacks. They were done by John P. Laird. That's why Central Pacific locomotives have Stevenson stacks or Stevens stacks. You could have a master mechanic dictate what kind of stack the locomotive had. You could take whatever the locomotive builder wanted to give you, or I'm making the assumption that they gave the customer a choice. Because yeah, there were all different kinds of stack. There were all different kinds of stack designs. And they all did roughly the same thing, and it's really hard to tell, which ones were better than the others.
John, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's fair to say that stacks as well as headlamps were kind of similar to what we would today call aftermarket auto part items, only they weren't aftermarket. There were manufacturers or there were inventors who had invented a particular kind of stack and was out promoting it on the market. And if a master mechanic liked that particular design of a stack, he could specify that, or he could say, go with your standard build.
Right. No, that's perfectly right as far as I'm concerned.
Most of the photographs that we see of these old locomotives, they look pretty clean when they made the photograph, but I would imagine burning all that freshly cut lumber, they would be pretty sooty most of the time.
Yeah, well, they did keep the locomotives clean. They had engine wipers. They had the engine crews. One of their jobs was to keep their locomotive in tip-top shape.
That's also a function of the engine. That was that engineer's locomotive, and that was his pet. And if it wasn't kept clean, there would be hell to pay with the wipers.
Right.
Yeah. Well, you got to remember, these things were the equivalent back then of $250,000 a piece. The railroads did not like anybody neglecting their expensive capital investments. So yeah, locomotives were, they paid a lot of special attention to locomotives and keeping them in good shape. Besides that, they were the first thing you ever saw on a train. They were the rolling advertisement for how well kept Your railroad was.
There's a public relations aspect too.
Right.
Fascinating.
So anyway,
Yeah.
Thanks for sticking around for all this.
That's great. So speaking of stacks, is that referred to as a balloon stack, the red locomotive in the back, in the middle ground there?
Yeah.
Balloons?
Well, they're all balloon stacks, basically. That's just kind of the generic name for the ones that flared out on top. But yeah, different designs. No, I wanted to, the one in the background is supposed to be a Danforth engine, so I copied a Danforth stack.
Flower stack.
John, I had a little comment on yellow ochre. I know it's one of the components of that brown color. I did some research because it's also a component of the color used in artillery carriages. And yellow ochre is a very funny thing. It's a natural iron oxide, and depending on where it comes from, it's different shade of color. So I don't know how much of influence that yellow ochre had on that color, but depending on where they got their yellow ochre, it may vary the end result.
Oh yeah, well that's one of the things I mentioned, that Pullman color was really difficult to match. It depended on who the master painter was and what kind of proportion of pigments he used,
and probably where they got
got the pigments.
Right.
Because, this paint was not stuff available in stores. They didn't have ready mixed paints back in Civil War time.
Yeah.
What you had was a master painter who had his secret little book of paint formulas that he inherited when he was an apprentice from his master.
So I guess
I think the takeaway is we shouldn't take all these color matches quite so seriously.
Yeah, that's what I was
I
just,
bet there was a lot of variation in it.
Mhm.
I was gonna say the same thing. You know, people trying to be perfect, and there was no such thing back then, I don't think. Uh,
That's the impression I get.
The other question I had is, I know that photography at that age was sensitive to lights, not across the broad spectrum. Have you ever tried to like use an analysis of the black and white pictures based on their sensitivity to different colors? Just
There have been volumes written on that. And it depends on whether it's orthographic photography and wet plate versus dry plate, and certain colors will show up different in orthographic
right.
versus, and even the scholars from Kodak and that sort of thing have written volumes, and from what I've seen, there's no real consensus on being able to take a black and white photograph and say, okay, that would have been this color or the other color. It's a morass.
It's too hard. Okay, I was just curious. I did get confused on artillery carriage colors at one point because of the yellow ochre component. I have some book that says, well, it's the carriage color was mustard. And then I did some analysis of carriage painted mustard versus one that was painted like what we would call like olive drab.
Well,
And you could really tell the difference in a black and white picture between that mustard and an olive drab. And from that, I know that book I had was wrong.
well, not necessarily, because in the older photographs, one thing that's very that can betray things, yellow turns up as a very dark color in the older.
Really?
Yes. Yes. That's been demonstrated. I've got a Santa Fe Historical Society where they took a photograph using the old, I think it's called orthographic film, and then using the more modern film of the same locomotive, and what is known to be a yellow stripe turns out looking almost brown or black. Or
Really? That's it. I've tried some experiments using like Photoshop, like restricting the color palette on modern pictures. It's just,
yeah. First thing you need to know is what process was used to make your original photograph.
right.
And if you don't know that, you're in the woods to begin with.
Okay, that's interesting.
Mike, you might want to take, Mark?
I was just going to say, correct me if I'm wrong. Did we not have a Zoom meet where this was a topic?
I
Where
was
there
just
were
gonna
actually some slides and stuff presented showing
Yeah.
the effect of older photographs and newer black and white photographs on the color spectrum?
Yeah, I was going to say Don Ball did one last year, a real thorough presentation.
Okay, I'll have
Is
to
that
look
one of
that
the
up.
ones
I
that got
missed that one.
recorded?
Yeah, it got recorded.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So we have
Awesome.
a resource.
Awesome.
What I could do for you, Mike, instead of having you go through all of those, let me see if I can pull it up and I'll just send you the link.
That would be great. Yeah, I did some experiments on my own. It's kind of weird, but
Me too. I know. That's why when Don said I could do that, cool.
We're all tempted to do that at one point or another.
yeah.
You always get warned away from it by the professionals.
Okay. Well, I didn't talk to any professionals first.
John, one thing I can add, I did some research on in the Baldwin books, but for a later period. And it seemed that by the 1880s, 1890s, Baldwin had they had their default standard paint scheme, or they had you can specify your own. And if I remember right, for the 1880s, 1890s, the standard Baldwin paint scheme was basically olive green with a black smoke box and Dulux or gold leaf lettering.
Right.
And then if you wanted anything that varied from that, you had to specify it. But for the 1860s, obviously that wasn't in place, because I've never seen an 1860s locomotive that was olive green with a black smoke box. That came later.
No, they didn't adopt the olive green until I think 1876.
Okay.
Before that, they had a period of a year where the basic ground color was lake, which was kind of a dark purplish brown.
Right.
And then before that, the standard color was wine color, which was real dark red. And they introduced that. I can actually pinpoint it in the notebooks where they start introducing wine color, but they don't adopt it as a standard until I think about 1872.
So question on that. So would the dark brown, so how long would the dark brown ground color have continued before it became not the standard?
Throughout the 1860s. Again, they were beginning to make a transition in the late 60s, and by 1872 or thereabouts, all the engines were being painted wine color.
Okay.
But up to that point, as far as I know, and I haven't dissected every railroad yet, but as far as I know, the umber was used as standard until then.
So until maybe 1872?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And I have a comment on keeping locomotives clean. Wood as a fuel is actually fairly clean burning.
More so than coal.
Much more so than coal. And I mean, when we see pictures of 20th century steam locomotives with these huge billowing black clouds of smoke, but you don't see that in anything from the 1860s. I have read, and I believe there's something to it, that general toning down of locomotive color schemes in the 1870s coincided with conversion to coal as fuel.
Yes.
If you started burning coal, boy, you couldn't keep a gaudily painted locomotive clean at all.
Yeah.
Good comment.
Well, that's pretty much documented, and you can almost tell by the fact that all the coal burning railroads were among the first to shift to really dark colors.
Yes.
Can I make a comment about paint and paint colors? My first job after I graduated from college in a chemistry degree, my first job was making paint. And the color of paint depends upon how it's manufactured, if you will. I could make 2 batches of paint in my lab, 2 different batches, exactly the same formula, exactly the same pigments, everything the same, and the colors were greatly different, depending upon how the particles are dispersed within the paint. The finer the particles are, then the lighter, I think, as I recall it, the lighter the color tends to appear. So when batches of paint were made in a paint factory, a sample was sent down to the lab, and there was a gentleman there in the lab whose job it was to match that color of paint to a standard that was kept in the laboratory and add a little bit of this or a little bit of that color to make the paint match. And so when we're talking about paint colors and you see a description of the paint color, well, it's kind of a general idea.
Yeah.
Someone earlier was asking about the brackets for the running boards. I have a close-up of the William Crooks that shows you how those running boards were attached. I'll share it here real quick. If you can see the bracket right there. that
Oh,
goes into
wow.
The jacket.
Yes.
There, you can see another one there. And this is what I found kind of interesting as I pulled it up, was this piece right here that's up underneath the running board. But it looks like those run right in and run through the jackets.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the way it was done, standard.
And that's a brass trim along it, correct?
Mhm.
Does it,
Brass
does it,
nosing.
what's that, John?
They say brass nosing.
Nosing.
Right.
And would that actually overlap onto it, or was that just flatly placed against the edge?
I think it had a little lip.
It did have a lip. Okay. Not that I want to paint that, but I want to paint at least I won't paint the lip, but I'll definitely paint the edge.
Keep your boot from slipping off, I suppose.
Could be, or just to secure it to the wood. Yeah. Yep. Yep. I painted mine yellow, but now that I know that was wrong. See, I learned something again. This is great.
Wouldn't the wood for the running boards, they would treat it with something, wouldn't they?
Linseed oil, maybe?
Yeah,
Yeah.
probably foil treatment of some sort.
The paint on that, William, on the crooks there looks shiny. Would that be the case?
Sure. They had multiple coats of varnish on them.
Ah, that would be shiny.
And then
Doesn't look as well on the HO scale.
Yeah.
in addition, they were, I don't know, I can't say for certain for US practice, but for British practice, they were covered with tallow as a polish before they were put in service. And I imagine, at least on passenger locomotives, that was also the case, that they would tallow their engines up before they ran, just to make sure they made a good presentable appearance.
And it looks like you have that brown color right there.
Yep, well, remember the William Crooks comes from the same age.
Yeah,
It
60
was built in
62.
1861. And I really don't know what, what they referred to when they reconstructed the engine in the 1920s. But it's entirely possible if somebody remembered, oh, this thing was painted brown and, brown and brass with red wheels, because that just fits right into the general scheme that I was talking about.
Wow. Okay.
Ron, where is the William Crooks right now?
It's in the Duluth Railroad Museum.
Oh,
So they
okay.
could have painted it maroon and gold in honor of the University of Minnesota. And that's their school color. So who knows why they picked what they picked when they restored it.
It looks like umber to me.
Yeah.
I haven't ever seen it in person, but from the photos, it all looks like it's umber.
Yep.
So one of the things I find interesting is that like the sand dome and the cylinder are painted, where I thought I would think the heat over after time would do something to like deteriorate it, but not necessarily.
Well, the sand domes escaped that. Of course, there wasn't any heat involved in the sand domes. But
Of course, right,
the steam domes were always wrapped in brass or Russia iron. That was their solution there. Same thing with the cylinders. You see a lot of cases where the cylinders and the steam chests were jacketed with brass.
Right.
And that was because of the heat.
Okay. So it could hold.
There would even be around the cylinders, some manufacturers would put slats of wood
Yeah.
as insulation to keep the cylinders warm. This was before asbestos.
Uh-huh. Yeah, they would lag the cylinders just like they would lag the boilers.
And that would keep the sheet metal, if you will, that was the cylinder cover, a little more, a little cooler. So you could afford to put a paint as opposed to a stove black. And that accounts for the difference between the smoke box being black and the cylinders perhaps being painted.
I wonder who decided to paint the front of the
Smoke box?
smoke box green.
It's gray, isn't it?
It's gray.
The sides are gray, the front's green, isn't it?
I
The
don't
same
think so.
color as the engine.
Yeah, it kind of looks that way.
Does it?
This is like one of those internet things. Is this dress blue or purple or whatever that internet meme was going on?
There's a green car to the rear right of the smoke box opening there. And also be careful, what sort of lighting are they using?
Yep.
Yeah, I think it's gray. I think it's just an illusion, like we always deal with when we're trying to figure this stuff out.
Well, most of the boiler looks like it's green though, from about that first brass
Yeah.
ring all the way back is green.
And I think that's the lighting playing tricks on us too, because I think that's probably a boiler jacket that's been painted gray to look like Russian iron, because it doesn't really look like Russian iron to me. It looks like it's painted.
Oh.
Having seen it in person, it's green.
It's green? Okay.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's a green color.
And
The
smoke
jacket, right, Ron?
Jacket is.
The
I do
boiler
not,
jacket,
I
right.
don't recall this being green. The
Okay.
front of the smoke box. And it actually, in places where the light's a little different, it does look gray. Like down here on that side where it's away from a reflected surface.
Yeah, to me, that looks like just untreated iron that's been stripped down to bare metal.
Yeah, there isn't much on that at all.
The
Smoke
band
jacket.
material, the brass bands look very thin. Is that correct? On some, maybe, others, no.
Mhm.
I know in the B&O, Mason, the bands are like barely raised above the jacket.
Well, they had to be sturdy enough to hold the jacket on. That was their function. They weren't there just for decoration. They served a purpose. But beyond that, I don't know.
The bands are actually kind of a channel shape with lips that fold down toward the boiler jacket. And the reason for that is the boiler jacket sheets of Russia iron have lips that project up a little bit, and the band overlaps that and holds that all together. And then usually down under the running board, there will be some screws that there will be brackets on the brass band and screws that tension them, that pull them down tight. If you really look at these old locomotives in various museums, you can see how that's put together, and it makes a lot of sense because that's how they held the sheet metal down on the wooden legging.
Exactly.
And it was really logical and not a lot of variation in method from manufacturer to manufacturer, but they would vary sometimes the width of the band depending on what they were joining to. For example, the bands near the steam dome are different than the band at the end of the jacketing adjacent to the smoke box.
Right.
And
I've noticed that too. Yes.
yeah. And so the body of the boiler that was jacketed was normally a lower temperature than the smoke box end of it. The smoke box end of it was the hot end of the boiler, really, to the exterior. And that hardly ever was able to hold paint. So those are almost always, if they were painted, it was a black. The Russia iron, if you looked at the sand domes or the steam domes on that locomotive, that's a more accurate representation of Russia iron, I think, than what they had on the boiler jacket.
It's a bit of a bluish tint, right?
Yeah, well, Russia iron is whatever color the sky is around it. It's kind of, there have been books written on defining the color of Russia iron. And to really get a feel for it, you actually have to find a locomotive that's got some and look at it and say, okay, that really isn't a color, it's a material.
There was
effectively a mirror.
Yeah, there's a piece of Russia iron that this buddy of mine, Kenny Pruitt from Michigan, sent me. And I was just looking for it to see if I could pull it up, but I can't. But in one of the next meets, I'll take a picture of it. And it has that almost like odd turquoise blue color to it. It's an actual piece that he got from when he was down. It might have been, it actually might have been from Colonel, what was the colonel's name that did all the research on the WNA? Nobody knows?
Kurtz?
No. His friend. And he wrote a book on the general in the Texas, Colonel Bogle.
Yeah.
Bogle. Yeah. So that'll be one of my to-dos next time. Because I thought, okay, now I've really got the color. But even he said, no, it depends on the sunlight. It could look almost black, if it's in the shade. So the good news about all this, guys, is you're pretty much got a lot of license to use any kind of variation of what you've been hearing from John and what you've been researching. So that's one of the fun things about this for me is you got that leeway. And it's always fun to, it's like a great coffee table conversation on your layout or layout conversation. And it's funny when people come up and somebody says, well, you know what, that really wasn't that color. Like, I'm okay. I'm open to that. So, go for it. What are you painting yours? You go, well, I don't have one. Or show me the research. We're always looking for research. Good. Anything else for John or anything else anybody wants to surface up?
So which of those locomotives, the one in the B&O or the one in Minnesota, which one's more authentic back to the Civil War period?
Boy, that's a good question.
The reason why I ask is my brother has a cabin an hour and a half from Duluth, and I get out there once in a while. I didn't realize they had a Civil War locomotive out there. And I do intend getting down to the B&O Museum also sometime.
As much as I love the William Mason, I'd say the Crooks is probably more representative.
Yeah.
I'd like to make one comment on the John's paintings is the running lights on the front of the engines. How long did they last? Because they all look like just hanging
Oh,
there.
you mean the lanterns?
Yes, the lantern.
Light bracket?
Yeah, because they're just hanging there. And with that engine moving around, bouncing back and forth, they would think they would bounce right off.
Hey, that's a good question. The reason I put them on is because you see them in the photograph.
I saw them on, yeah, I did see that one photograph you had there that had them on there.
Mhm.
But the front of that engine bouncing back and forth and moving up and down.
Well, I think for the most part, the trains weren't running too fast.
No, we know that.
Right. So
But the track work wasn't very good either.
right. And it could be that it was hung there temporarily because they were doing something in the yard or what have you, not necessarily actually on the line. But I would imagine they had them if they needed to, if they knew they were going to run at night. This is a question. They probably would have had those lanterns. I mean, at the very least, they could have held them in a conductor's car or in the locomotive, if not hanging. Or if they needed to mark the back of the train because they knew there was a convoy of trains.
I think on the U.S. military railroad, the way they were set up was those lights served the same function at night as the flags did during the day, to let them know there was another section of train coming behind.
Right.
Because they, the way they fired a sequence of trains down the track.
Right.
And somebody told, I'm not sure if it was Al way back when or one of the guys at one of the meetings who explained it, that those lights were signals. And
right.
The main headlight was the light to see with, but those hanging lights were signals.
Got it. Yeah.
I would like to share screen here for a second and see if I can get something up here. Are you seeing this?
Yeah, the Sam Hill.
Okay, that locomotive goes by the name of Sam Hill. It's in the Henry Ford Museum. It's it's my nearest local 1850s locomotive. It was originally called the Setillo, or maybe Setillo, and it's a 1850s Rogers, very much a contemporary of the General. And it's been in this restored condition since Henry Ford had it restored in the 20s. And it never seems to get included in discussions of surviving locomotives. I just sort of put it up there for, I grabbed this image off the internet while we were talking. The boiler cylinders, steam chest, are probably, if it was restored in the 20s and that was replaced or added, they're probably American iron, which is, I think, considered not quite as primo as Russia iron, but still pretty good. And it's got a varnished cab.
Right.
No idea, where they got this paint job. Probably not researched nearly as well as, what John has just done, but I just sort of put this out here for your consideration.
Right. Yeah, I think Jerry turned me onto that locomotive a long time ago. That one does not get enough airtime. I'm glad you pulled that up. And it looks like it says Atlanta on the back on that tender. What does that say?
Atlantic.
Oh.
Atlantic and Gulf, maybe.
Okay.
I'm not sure. I mean, on the number plate or plate on the smoke box front, it says President, and on the cab it says Sam Hill. And Sam Hill, I believe, was the name of an engineer who ran it for quite a while, and was called President because it pulled the special train. Must have been Hoover was the president then, yeah, to Greenfield Village when it was opened in 1929. And it hasn't run for years. And as restorations go, it seems to me to be pretty reasonable. Again, I don't know about the details of the the paint job, but it's not garish, it's not gaudy. It looks plausible to me.
Right.
It has, you can see it's got the Rogers type of fluting on the sand dome. It has, if you look in the reproduction Rogers catalog, if anybody knows what that is and has it, boy, does it match a lot of the features that are shown in there for Rogers locomotives of the time. So I think it hasn't been hugely altered. I think it may have received smaller drivers than it was built with, but that was not uncommon.
Right.
And
one thing I noticed on there is the obvious that little pipe coming out of the base of the stack. And I believe there was a thing called a spark pipe. I think I shared this a long time ago.
Well, that's a washout plug.
Yeah,
I believe.
for cleaning the ash out.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, there was in Kurtz's notes, he had a diagram of this long pipe that had a curve on the end, and it was called a spark. What the hell was it? Spark pipe or something? And I found it's a cool detail because they would have, I think, carried that either on the back of the tender, someone, or I think even Kurtz mentioned they might have left it on or fastened it to the pilot across the beam. Anybody familiar with that? No.
No.
If you look at the current edition of Model Railroader, you'll see some mention of these spark pipes, as you call them, used for cleaning the ash and cinders out of the smokestack. And it's
Right.
just as you described it, that you carry them on the tender or carry them on the pilot bin.
You know what, John, drop your screen. I'll just pull this up real quick. Can you see that?
Oh, yeah.
a spark pipe, according to Mr. Harbin, Wiley Harbin. I think he was, he assisted on the Texas. And it had those two. Yeah, I made a couple of these. I got them laying in my roundhouse. I put one on my locomotive, but it fell off and derailed the train. So I thought that's a bad idea.
It does look like something that you could put up against the clean out.
Right.
It just would direct all the cylinders down toward the track and the roadbed rather than down the shirt collar of the fireman.
Right.
Whoever's doing the clean out. It looks like it looks like it's something that would go along with a balloon stack clean out.
Yeah. To empty them of sparks or small cylinders that, owing to the spark arrestor, accumulate in the space, blah, blah. Black sheet iron, about 6 feet long. Yeah, cool. Yeah, I just thought that was a cool detail to add on to the locomotive.
Probably was not in a locomotive, though. It was probably in the yard, and it was just a maintenance tool.
Oh, right. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Yeah, cool, Tom. Thank you. Good. Then I've left them in the roundhouse where they belong. Good.
Yeah.
Good. All right.
One thing about the Satilla, I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it right or not. That locomotive has always been really problematic because they didn't have very good documentation on it. When they brought it to the Ford Museum, they just kind of, they knew they had to turn out a Rogers locomotive for Mr. Ford, and they just went to town on it. But a lot of the things on that engine, a lot of things about that engine indicate that it was really heavily modified before it was even thought about as being something for preservation.
It almost looks like they used the General as a template, knowing that it was a Rogers locomotive to complete the restoration on it.
Well, if it was a genuine pre-war Rogers locomotive, it would have had 2 steam domes.
Right.
Just like the original General did. And that means that this one probably got a new boiler somewhere along the line, or 2 or 3, before it was thought about for preservation.
Yeah, that's very likely. I've been through the files at the research center at the Henry Ford and copied what I could out of it. And somewhere I may have a photo of what it looked like when it arrived on the property.
The passenger coach is a reconstruction. So I don't think there's an original bolt on it.
Correct. Well, what's interesting about that is that when I was a kid, there was a train of 3 cars in there. And 2 of them were built from the ground up, totally brand new. And the one that's left now is a reconstruction, but like you said, there's how much of the original is unclear. There's an illustration in John White's American Passenger Car book of a passenger car, and that same illustration is included in the museum's file on that car, and this car is made to that. The paintings in some of the panels even duplicate what's on that one. But there is some shred of originality there, but it might not be more than a couple of toothpicks. The interior, for example, is all 19th century fittings and furnishings, but a lot of them have patent dates, into the 1870s. So it's, I don't know, it's better than a complete reconstruction, but not too much, not really too authentic.
Well, they're fun. They give the feel for what things were like back then. There's value in that.
No, the real counterfeit in the museum's collection was the little 440 that the Ford shops kit bashed out of an 040 switcher. And when I was a kid, that was in the museum lettered for Lakeshore and Michigan Southern and represented to be a Mason. And the fact that it's now, or for the last 20 years or so, been pulling customers around the village, sort of, you can see that they're not treating it as an authentic locomotive. And it's easy enough to tell that it didn't start out life as a 440. All you have to do is look at the side rods on it. They're not connected like a 440s are connected. On a 440, and not many models of 440s, the main rod is always on the inside of the side rod. And on that locomotive, it's not. And on most of the inexpensive models that we get, they're not. So that's just one little feature you can look for on that type of locomotive.
Wow. Good. Well, gentlemen, we are at our time, and for all of us, John, thanks so much. That was another great presentation. Very stimulating conversation. Took off a couple of avenues that was really cool. Thank you so much for sharing that information with us. It was great.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It'll all go up in the files section as soon as I get around to it.
Sure. Cool.
Okay.
And then next time, I'll send you an email with the next couple that are coming out. It'll be some combination of Charlie and the what? And Rhett or Rhett. Yep. Coming up. And there's a couple of other things we have in the queue. And then we're still toying with the idea of a physical gathering sometime in early fall. So stay tuned. We'll keep you posted on that. Everybody stay well, have fun doing whatever modeling or research you're doing, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Tom.
you, guys.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Tom.
My pleasure.